It happened in the space of 36 hours, and the speed of it is the thing that should alarm everyone watching this conflict. On the evening of Friday, April 17th of 2026, Donald Trump stood in front of a crowd at Dream City Church in Phoenix, Arizona, and told the world that the Iran negotiations were essentially complete. He said most of the points are already negotiated and agreed to. He said this process should go very quickly. He told the crowd they will be very happy with what is coming. He claimed Iran had agreed to hand over its nuclear material. He claimed Iran had agreed to open the Strait of Hormuz and never close it again. He claimed the war was just a military excursion and that the deal was imminent. Every word of it designed to produce a specific impression, that something big was about to happen, that a major diplomatic breakthrough was one announcement away, that the world was watching the final hours before a historic deal. 36 hours later, on Saturday, April 18th, Iran's Joint Military Command posted its own announcement. Control of the Strait of Hormuz has returned to its previous state. 2 IRGC gunboats approached the very large crude carrier Sanmar Herald, a tanker that had received prior clearance from the IRGC to transit the strait, and fired on it without a single word of warning on the radio. A container ship northeast of Oman reported being struck by an unknown projectile. The strait that Trump said Iran had agreed to never close again was closed. The deal that Trump said was mostly done had produced no second round of talks. And Donald Trump, according to Wikipedia's live updated conflict timeline, sourced from multiple verified outlets, said he no longer cares about negotiations. 36 hours. From most of the points are already agreed to he no longer cares about negotiations. From Iran agreed to everything, to Iran fires on a tanker with a valid clearance code. From you'll be very happy with what's coming, to the ceasefire that expires on Wednesday, April 22nd, now has no confirmed second round of talks scheduled to save it. By the end of this video, on Sunday, April 19th of 2026, you are going to understand exactly what happened in those 36 hours. Why the pattern of Trump promising a major surprise, followed by Iran doing the opposite, is not random diplomatic noise, but a specific and repeating structural dynamic that has defined every phase of this conflict since February 28th, what the specific sticking points are that make every breakthrough announcement collapse before the ink dries, and what the Wednesday, April 22nd ceasefire expiration means for global oil markets, global shipping, and the 300 million people whose economies depend on 20% of the world's oil moving through 39 miles of Iranian-controlled water. Let us start with the pattern because the pattern is everything. And the pattern has repeated itself so many times since the conflict began on February 28th that understanding it is the only way to evaluate anything either side says. Between now and Wednesday, Trump announces a breakthrough. Iran contradicts it. Markets move on the announcement. Markets reverse on the contradiction. The cycle runs again. Count the instances just from the documented record of the last 7 weeks. On March 9th of 2026, Trump said the war is very complete, pretty much. He claimed the Iranian military had been destroyed. He claimed the Strait of Hormuz had reopened. According to the Wikipedia conflict timeline, both claims were false at the time he made them. The Iranian military had not been destroyed. The strait had not reopened. Trump announced a reality that did not exist, and the market briefly priced it. On April 1st, Trump claimed Iran had asked the United States for a ceasefire. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps separately stated the same day that the strait will not be open to the enemies of this nation. 2 contradictory announcements from 2 governments on the same day about the same conflict. On April 7th, Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire with Iran, less than 2 hours before his own deadline for destroying what he had called Iran's whole civilization. He said Iran had agreed to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz as the condition for the ceasefire. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announced the ceasefire on social media, including all fronts and all countries, including Lebanon. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu rejected the inclusion of Lebanon on the same day the ceasefire was announced. Iran paused Hormuz traffic hours after the ceasefire declaration, citing Israeli strikes in Lebanon as a violation. The ceasefire was barely hours old before both sides were arguing about what it covered. On April 8th, Trump held a press conference where he said there will be no enrichment of uranium, and the United States will, working with Iran, dig up and remove all of the deeply buried nuclear dust. J.D. Vance on the same day described what Trump called a ceasefire as actually a fragile truce. 2 members of the same American administration giving the same agreement 2 different names on the same day in public. On April 11th and 12th, J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner arrived in Islamabad for what was described as historic direct talks. The Iranian delegation included Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. The session ran for 21 hours. Vance left on April 12th, saying the ball is in Iran's court. Araghchi said gaps on major issues remained. Ghalibaf said trust had not been established. Trump announced a naval blockade of Iranian ports effective April 13th. That is the specific sequence of events that every observer of this conflict needs to have memorized before evaluating anything that happens in the next 72 hours. The pattern is not accidental. It is structural. It reflects the specific geometry of a negotiation where the two sides' core demands are not just different in degree, but incompatible in kind. Understanding why every Trump surprise announcement is followed by an Iranian countermove that makes the surprise evaporate requires understanding what the actual sticking points are and why they have not moved in 7 weeks, despite 21 hours of direct talks in Islamabad. Sticking point 1, uranium enrichment. Trump's position, stated repeatedly and confirmed by White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller on Fox News as recently as April 15th, is that Iran cannot enrich uranium at all, not at lower levels, not with inspections, not in any form. Stephen Miller said this is Trump's red line and he will use force if necessary to enforce it. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said should Iran develop nuclear weapons, there will be all hell to pay. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on April 18th of 2026 that Iran is violating existing agreements and nearing the capability to develop a nuclear weapon. And he urged European countries to quickly reimpose sanctions. Iran's position, stated repeatedly by every Iranian official from the foreign ministry to the parliament speaker to President Pezeshkian, is that uranium enrichment is an inalienable right that cannot be negotiated away in any form. The Iranian negotiating team told the American delegation in Islamabad that zero enrichment and dismantling Iran's nuclear sites would not help in progressing the negotiations. An Iranian official close to the negotiating team said directly that ending the enrichment program or surrendering enriched uranium are among Iran's red lines that could not be compromised. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson, Ismail Baghei, confirmed on April 17th that enriched uranium is as sacred to us as Iranian soil and will not be transferred anywhere under any circumstances. The American red line on enrichment and the Iranian red line on enrichment are the same issue from opposite directions. America says Iran cannot enrich at all. Iran says the right to enrich cannot be compromised. These two positions have the same subject and opposite predicates. They cannot both be the basis of the same agreement. One of them has to move before any deal is possible. Neither has moved in 7 weeks. Sticking point 2, war reparations. Iran's delegation in Islamabad presented a list of conditions that includes compensation for war damages as a core demand. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Baghei stated on April 17th that compensation for war damages was one of Iran's top priorities in any negotiations. The conflict that Iran is seeking reparations for began February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched what CENTCOM described as major combat operations against Iran. 15,000 targets were struck. 5,700 combat sorties were flown. Iranian oil infrastructure was hit, including the Lavan oil refinery where crude oil seeped from multiple tanks into the Persian Gulf after an April 8th airstrike, producing an oil spill visible from space and satellite imagery taken on April 10th. Trump's characterization of this conflict on April 17th in Phoenix was that it was just a military excursion, not the biggie, not the big time. The specific incompatibility between an American president publicly calling the conflict an excursion and Iran's negotiating team presenting a formal reparations demand for the damages that excursion caused is the sticking point that has received the least coverage but may be the hardest to resolve of all the structural gaps. You cannot pay reparations for an excursion. The word excursion is Trump's framing for his domestic audience. The reparations demand is Iran's formal position at the negotiating table. The gap between those two things is not a communications problem. It is a fundamental disagreement about the nature and magnitude of what happened. Sticking point 3, Lebanon. Iran's position from the first day of the ceasefire has been that a comprehensive agreement must include Lebanon. Iran has insisted that the Lebanese front, meaning the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, is part of the same regional conflict and cannot be separated from any comprehensive ceasefire framework. Iranian National Security Advisor Mahdi Mohammadi said, "Without fully restraining America's rabid dog in Lebanon, there will be no ceasefire or negotiations." This was Iran's stated condition before the Islamabad talks began. The American position, backed by Israel, is that Lebanon is not part of the Iran deal. Netanyahu rejected Sharif's inclusion of Lebanon in the ceasefire announcement on April 8th, within hours of the announcement being made. Trump and Vance both backed Netanyahu's position. The 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah that Trump announced on April 16th was described by Trump himself as not connected to the Iran agreement. Iran's foreign ministry welcomed that Lebanon's ceasefire as consistent with the broader framework and credited Pakistan's diplomacy. But the structural question of whether Lebanon's status as a permanently separate issue or an integral part of any comprehensive deal remains unresolved. Sticking point 4, the Strait of Hormuz and the toll regime. Iran's parliament passed legislation on March 31st of 2026, imposing a $1 per barrel toll on all vessels transiting the strait. Iran's negotiating team in Islamabad included control of strait traffic and the toll regime as part of its demand package. Trump's position is that the strait must be completely and immediately open, with no limitations and no tolls, and no IRGC control of transit routes. Iran's position is that the open or closed status and the rules governing the strait are determined in the field, not by social media, as Ghalibaf posted at midnight on Friday, April 17th. These 4 sticking points, enrichment, reparations, Lebanon, and the strait, are not new. They were the same 4 sticking points when the conflict began. They were the same 4 sticking points when the Islamabad talks collapsed on April 12th after 21 hours. They are the same 4 sticking points on Sunday, April 19th of 2026, with the ceasefire expiring on Wednesday. None of them has moved. None of them has been resolved. And every Trump announcement of a surprise breakthrough and every Iran countermove that deflates the announcement is playing out against the background of 4 structural gaps that no amount of truth social posting or Phoenix rally rhetoric has closed by even a measurable distance. Now let us go to what specifically happened between Trump's Phoenix speech and Iran's decision to close the strait on Saturday, April 18th, because the sequence reveals the specific mechanism by which the surprise announcement became the talk suspension. Trump's Phoenix speech on Friday, April 17th, was not a diplomatic communication. It was a political performance delivered to a domestic audience at a Turning Point action rally. The crowd cheered when Trump said NATO was absolutely useless. The crowd applauded when Trump said the war was just a military excursion. The crowd responded to Trump's claim that Iran had agreed to everything with the enthusiasm that a friendly crowd responds to a president claiming victory. The speech was not designed to move Iran's negotiating position. It was designed to move American domestic political sentiment in a specific direction. And it worked for the specific audience it was targeting. The problem is that Iran's parliament speaker Ghalibaf was also watching. And Ghalibaf, who was personally present in Islamabad on April 11th and 12th and knows exactly what was and was not agreed in that room, posted his response at midnight Tehran time with a precision that made it impossible to interpret as anything other than a direct institutional rebuttal. 7 claims, 1 hour, all 7 false. The post did not hedge. It did not use diplomatic language. It counted the lies and named them and directed people to the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman's interview as the source of accurate information. That midnight post was not the immediate cause of Iran closing the strait on Saturday morning. The immediate cause was the American blockade of Iranian ports remaining in force after the strait opened on Friday. The IRGC's logic was the same logic Ghalibaf had telegraphed in the same post. If the blockade continues, the strait will not remain open. The blockade continued through Friday night. The strait closed Saturday morning. The logic was not a threat. It was an announced consequence that was then executed exactly as announced. And the specific decision inside the Iranian system to execute that consequence on Saturday, April 18th, rather than wait for Monday's scheduled second round of talks, is the decision that most directly answers the question embedded in this video's title. Iran did not halt the next round of talks through a diplomatic cable or a formal notification. Iran halted the next round of talks by making Monday's talks either impossible to hold without a prior resolution of the blockade question, or impossible to hold with any Iranian credibility if Iran attended after the IRGC had already closed the strait in response to the blockade's continuation. The Iranian National Security Commission head said closing the strait was response to America's untrustworthiness. That word, untrustworthiness, is the diplomatic characterization that explains why attending Monday's talks after the strait closure would have undermined Iran's negotiating position rather than advanced it. You do not sit down to negotiate with a party you have just publicly accused of untrustworthiness without some acknowledgement from that party that the accusation has been heard and addressed. No such acknowledgement came from Washington on Saturday, April 18th. Trump's response to the strait closure was reported by Wikipedia's live updated Iran war timeline as Trump saying he no longer cares about negotiations. He had said on Friday afternoon the deal was close. He had said, "You'll be very happy." He had said this process should go very quickly. By Saturday evening, after Iran closed the strait again, the same president who said agreed to everything said he no longer cares about negotiations. The distance between those two statements, from agreed to everything to no longer cares about negotiations, measured in hours, not days, is the specific Trump-Iran diplomatic cycle that has repeated itself throughout this conflict, and that the April 22nd deadline now forces to a resolution or a resumption of war with no intermediate option available. Here is the specific significance of the King Charles deadline that has received almost no coverage in the mainstream analysis of this conflict. Time magazine reported on April 15th that Trump was hinting at a possible deal ahead of King Charles III visiting the White House at the end of April. Trump has been positioning himself for the Nobel Peace Prize throughout this conflict. Pakistan has already recommended him for it. The specific political and personal incentive for Trump to produce a peace deal announcement before a ceremonial state visit by the British monarch is real, and it is being discussed by people with direct knowledge of the White House's thinking. The April 22nd ceasefire deadline and the end of April King Charles visit create a specific 14-day window that Trump's political calendar treats as the deal-making zone. The problem is that the four structural sticking points do not care about the King Charles visit. The enrichment red line does not adjust to accommodate ceremonial state visits. The reparations demand does not narrow because a British monarch is coming to the White House. The toll law passed by Iran's parliament on March 31st does not expire because Trump wants a photo opportunity. The mines in the Strait of Hormuz, whose exact positions Iran itself has lost track of, do not clear themselves because of a diplomatic calendar consideration. Stephen Miller's appearance on Fox News on approximately April 15th, in which he said Trump holds all the cards and Iran has none, and that America's military operation could wipe out Iran's energy infrastructure for generations, is the specific American framing of the negotiations' leverage structure. And it is the framing that Iran's entire institutional response since February 28th has been designed to contest. The Iranian counterframing, delivered most precisely in Golubov's Midnight Post, is that America tried lies in the war and lost, and will not get anywhere in negotiations through lies either. The two framings, America holds all the cards versus America tried and failed to win through military force, are what is actually being negotiated in Islamabad when the talks happen, and what is being contested in the Strait when they do not. The ceasefire expires Wednesday, April 22nd. It is Sunday, April 19th. That means 72 hours, separate the current moment from the specific expiration that determines whether the most intensive air campaign in the region's history resumes, whether 20% of global oil stays bottled up or flows, whether oil stays near $100 a barrel or drops, and whether the global recession risk that the IMF downgraded every major economy to account for in its most recent forecast materializes or recedes. What is confirmed as of Sunday, April 19th is this: the second round of talks has no confirmed date. The Council on Foreign Relations article published April 13th, written by James Lindsay, who is the Mary and David Boys Distinguished Senior Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy, concluded that abandoning the blockade, after only just announcing it, would create substantial diplomatic and political costs for Trump, and may convince Tehran that intransigence is its winning strategy. The specific dilemma that Lindsay identified is still unresolved on Sunday, April 19th. The blockade is still in place. Iran closed the strait in direct response to the blockade being in place. The ceasefire expires in 72 hours with no second round of talks confirmed to produce either an agreement or an extension before that deadline. Al Jazeera's reporting, as of April 16th, confirmed that no date has been set for the second round. Kamran Yusuf, an Islamabad-based journalist and expert on diplomatic affairs, told Al Jazeera that he expected the ceasefire to be extended, saying he would be really surprised if the current ceasefire is not extended because there is little appetite on both sides to go back to war. Faisal, a second analyst interviewed in the same Al Jazeera piece, offered the more cautious assessment that Pakistan's mediation will not collapse immediately, but Islamabad's role will change from mediator to crisis manager if a second round does not happen. That specific shift, from mediator to crisis manager, is what the IRGC's gunfire on the Sanmar Herald Saturday morning has potentially forced. A mediator manages the gap between two sides in a negotiation. A crisis manager manages the gap between two sides after one of them has fired on a tanker with a valid clearance code. The operational and diplomatic situation required for mediation to function includes both sides refraining from actions that make the other side's return to the table domestically politically impossible. Iran firing on a ship with clearance is an action that makes the second round of talks harder to justify to Iran's own domestic political audience, because returning to the table after IRGC gunboats had just demonstrated the strait is under Iranian control requires Iran to explain what it got in exchange for that demonstration. And the American side faces a mirror image of the same problem. Trump said Friday that the deal is basically done. If Trump convenes a second round of talks on Monday or Tuesday without extracting from Iran any commitment on the four sticking points that were unresolved on April 12th, the second round simply reproduces the first round, which reproduced the gap that has existed since February 28th. The political cost of a second failed round, with the ceasefire expiring Wednesday, is higher than the cost of the first failed round because there is no third round scheduled and no ceasefire extension confirmed. Pakistan's Field Marshal, Asim Munir, is the specific individual whose shuttle diplomacy is the only mechanism currently operating between the two sides that has a track record of producing any result at all. It was Munir and Prime Minister Sharif who convinced Trump to agree to the 2-week ceasefire on April 7th. It was Munir's meetings in Tehran on April 16th with Ghalibaf, President Pezeshkian, and IRGC Commander Major General Ali Abdullahi that represented the last known direct diplomatic contact between any mediating party and Iran's decision-making chain before the strait closed Saturday morning. Whether Munir has had any communication with either side in the hours since the strait closure that would form the basis of a ceasefire extension or a reconvened second round before Wednesday is not public information as of Sunday, April 19th. What is public is the specific structural situation that every piece of verified data from the last 72 hours confirms. Trump promised a major surprise. Iran closed the strait. Trump said he no longer cares about negotiations. The ceasefire expires in 72 hours. The 4 sticking points have not moved. And the 39 miles of water between the Arabian Peninsula and the Iranian coast currently contain IRGC gunboats that fire on ships with valid clearance codes, mines whose exact positions Iran itself cannot fully account for. A new naval base on Qeshm Island inaugurated during the ceasefire, and the physical infrastructure of a toll regime backed by parliamentary law that makes Iranian control of the strait permanent in Iranian domestic legislation, regardless of what any diplomatic agreement says. This is the specific moment on Sunday, April 19th of 2026, not the moment that Trump's Phoenix speech described. Not the moment of imminent breakthrough and agreed terms and a happy ending coming soon. The moment where a ceasefire with 72 hours left has no confirmed second round of talks. Where the Sanmar Herald has a bullet hole to replace the clearance code that was supposed to guarantee its safe passage. Where Trump says he no longer cares about negotiations after saying on Friday that most points are already agreed. Where Iran's parliament speaker says 7 claims in 1 hour were all false, while his government's military fires on tankers to demonstrate which claim about the strait is accurate. The pattern that has run since February 28th is this. Trump announces a breakthrough. Iran demonstrates that the breakthrough has not happened. Markets move on the announcement and reverse on the demonstration. The ceasefire absorbs the contradiction, and the 4 sticking points remain exactly where they were before the announcement and the demonstration, until Wednesday, when the ceasefire stops absorbing anything because it has expired. The major surprise is the announcement that has not yet come. The halt in talks is the demonstration that already has. And the 72 hours between Sunday, April 19th and Wednesday, April 22nd is the specific window in which the pattern that has defined this entire conflict has to produce a different outcome than it has produced in every previous cycle. Either the sticking points move, or the ceasefire expires, or the ceasefire extends. Those are the 3 outcomes. No other outcome is available. The shuttle diplomacy that has to produce one of those 3 outcomes is not visible in any public reporting as of Sunday, April 19th. The talks have no confirmed date. The blockade continues. The strait is closed again, and Trump says he no longer cares about negotiations. 36 hours. From the world will be very happy to the gunboats fired without warning. That is where this conflict stands on the morning of Sunday, April 19th of 2026. And Wednesday is in 3 days,